Led Zeppelin 3, Led Zeppelin 4, Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones. Who's Next by The Who. Let me just name all the artists. Iron Maiden, Bob Marley, Fleetwood Mac, Santana, Dire Straits, Deep Purple. What if I told you that all of these bands recorded their albums in the back of the same truck? Secretly, behind the scenes of all these records is this truck. It's responsible for a massive chunk of rock history from the 70s and 80s. Here it is outside the recording of Led Zeppelin 4. That's Robert Plant with it right there. Here it is in France with Deep Purple. I don't know about you, but whenever I think of like old records, I'm thinking of this massive grand recording space. But no, a lot of it was the same truck. This is called the RSM, or the Rolling Stones Mobile Studio. I want to go over why this thing exists, all of the gear inside it, and how it all sort of functioned. The Rolling Stones Mobile Studio, or the RSM, Deep Purple called it the Rolling Stones thing. This was a 22-foot long BMC chassis truck. It was painted in all camouflage. Now later, this whole back of the truck was moved to a DAF F1600 turbo diesel. This isn't a car channel, you don't need to know that. But the whole thing weighed like 22,000 pounds, and the dimensions were roughly 8 foot by 22 foot by 9 feet tall. Now, as the name implies, this thing was made by the Rolling Stones in the 1970s. They were frustrated by the constraints of a normal recording studio. Studios were expensive hourly rates. You were often writing, rehearsing, and recording there. There was travel time involved, and there was an inability to work whenever they wanted. So in 1970, Mick Jagger bought this place called Stargrove. This is a New Hampshire estate in the English countryside. The whole idea was they were going to build a studio here, but they realized the logistics of moving all the necessary equipment into that studio would be kind of hard. So this guy named Ian Stewart, who was the road manager for the Stones at the time, he proposed the idea of building it on a truck. So Ian Stewart, along with the very famous Glenn Johns, helped design this thing. They took all the same equipment that you would find in Olympus Studios and they put it in the back of this truck. This means that this studio had a custom 3224 Helios mixing console inside of it, which is crazy. The housing of it was made to be a custom smaller footprint than a normal console, and it was modeled after Studio 2 in Olympic Studios. They put two 3M M79 tape machines inside of it. This gave them a total of 32 inputs to record to this truck. Whole thing costed about $79,000, which in today's money is about $500,000. I don't know, I kind of thought it'd be more than that. The whole thing had a mic locker with about 100 different microphones in it, and correct me if I get the name of this wrong, tannoy and Oratone monitors. Let me just list you some of the outboard that this place had, because this is kitted out better than most modern studios today. Two Uri 1176 compressors, Lexicon 224 reverb, Lexicon digital delay. This was probably added in post around the 80s to late 90s. EQs by Pultec, Langevin, and Orban, an Eventide harmonizer, and an LA2A compressor. You know, this thing existed from the 70s all the way up to the 90s. So there was probably a lot of things in between, but these are some of the highlights. So with this thing completed, the Stones could record wherever they wanted to. Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street were both recorded on this bus. This also allowed the band to record for really laborious hours. I mean, days and days on end without racking up hourly rates. Other bands quickly started to realize the benefits of this thing. So the Rolling Stones turned this whole bus into a business. And as I alluded to, countless other bands paid the rental fee to use this truck. Led Zeppelin, Dire Straits, Fleetwood Mac, Bob Marley, Iron Maiden. I mean, there's a whole Wikipedia page with a bunch of lists of all the credits that this thing has. Probably one of the most famous pieces to be recorded on this thing was Smoke on the Water, Deep Purple. This one actually has a pretty crazy story to it, some of which you might know, but the RSM was kind of part of this whole scene. It was 1971 at the Montreux Casino Theater in Switzerland. The RSM was there recording Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. During the Frank Zappa concert, somebody set off a flare gun in the crowd, and that whole theater burned to the ground. The RSM actually barely escaped that fire. The Rolling Stones team had to break a window, turn the emergency brake off, and push the truck away from the flames. Long story short, Deep Purple was looking for a studio. They ended up getting a bunch of noise complaints. They ended up working at this hotel called the Grand Hotel de Territet. which I probably got wrong. They converted the hallways and the stairwells into this sort of like makeshift live room with a bunch of mattresses and stuff. And the RSM was the control room to that recording session. This meant that even though they were working in a stairwell with all these mattresses and stuff, they didn't have to compromise on the equipment or the console. This kind of shows how versatile that this whole truck was. I mean, during that week, that truck recorded 3 different sessions in 3 different locations. And we even have some pretty in-depth information from it on how Deep Purple was recorded. I mean, on the drums, we have an AKG D20 on the kick, an AKG D19 on the snare, 2 U87s as overheads, and Bayer M160s on the toms. Ritchie Blackmore's guitar was most likely a Marshall Major with a 412 cab, again mic'd with either U67s or U87s. For the bass, we have a Rickenbacker 4001 and an Ampeg SVT. The vocal was also recorded on a U87 or a U67. And all of that went through the Helios console onto 16-track 2-inch tape. And probably most famously, When the Levee Breaks was recorded on the RSM. I mean, reportedly, they tried to get this drum sound in a studio, and according to Andy Johns, it was sounding too flat. Moving this truck to Headley Grange meant that they had interesting acoustic environments in order to work with, including the famous stairwell. That was recorded with 2 Bayer Dynamic N160s at the top of the stair. The most famous drum sound of all time, I would argue, had 2 distant microphones. These M160s were then ran through a Benson Echo Rec delay unit, adding a slapback effect and then slowed down in post on tape to add more low end. The signal flow looks a little bit like this. Now these are just 2 examples, but as you can see, there is a ton of more documentation on what this truck actually recorded. I highly recommend you go check out the website below. Now, even though the RSM was incredibly flexible and it allowed a lot of people to record in a lot of different environments, it didn't come without its compromises. To start with, what do you think a custom built console for the back of a truck, what do you think happens to it when it's driven all across Europe? It needed constant maintenance. Everything had to be kind of like locked down in flight cases whenever it moved. Crossing borders was a nightmare with all this world-class audio equipment. Weather and temperature fluctuations was a huge challenge. The RSM had dedicated air conditioning units that was actually for the equipment more than it was for the people in there. But whenever you're recording and tracking, you need to turn these air conditioner units off. Fans were added in 1974 and 1975 because the gear was constantly overheating during recording sessions. The truck was constantly put in places that it was not suited to be. I mean, look at this picture. That looks like, I don't know where it is, somewhere in France, but it looks kind of tropical. From the back of hotels and damp basements, coastal villas, condensation was a really big problem in this thing. The power was different from place to place. This meant that you got different levels of hum and noise depending on where you were located. And last but not least, the suspension. BMC vehicles were built for loading cargo and for farmers. The engine failed constantly, and eventually, like we mentioned in the beginning, the entire thing was taken off and loaded onto a DAF F1600 turbo diesel. And that chassis is actually how it exists today. Later in life, this truck kind of became a different thing. It became more about live broadcasting audio-visual shows than it did for recording records. It became really useful for the BBC, for Capital Radio, and for recording live radio broadcasts for people like Miles Davis or Willie Nelson, until eventually it was sold to a guy named Bill Wyman in 1985, and it had a completely different use after that. He created something called the AIMS project, basically ambition, invention, motivation, and success. The idea was to give new bands a chance to record really high quality demos in the back of this thing. And then, this is crazy to think about because I was born in 1997, but in 1996, this thing was still being used because it was purchased again by Loho Studios in New York City, shipped across the ocean. And it was used to record more records from bands like the Ramones and Patti Smith, until eventually, when the digital era started to arrive, I know, buzzkill for everyone, ruins everything, it eventually started being parted out. And that's when the National Music Center bought it. The final resting place for the RSM is in Calgary, Canada. Actually, it was supposed to be driven up to Calgary, Canada, but it broke down outside Chicago and had to be towed. But you know what? Like, don't be sad. This thing is a hardcore veteran, so it couldn't make its final journey. Give it a break. It's tired. The National Music Center restored it as faithfully as possible. And there, in Calgary, Canada, it sits as still a functional, operational studio. Although it's completely stationary, it's still making records, dude. Future Now's Second Skin was recorded in it. The Harpoonist and the Axe Murderer. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know these people, but Cool. So what kind of began as this sort of problem that needed a solution sort of transformed into this iconic piece of rock history. Not only that, kind of sticking to the channel theme here, the RSM kind of proves that you don't need ideal conditions in order to make music. Think about Deep Purple, Smoke on the Water. That was a stairwell with mattresses, and the control center came to them. But more than anything, I think this is just this amazing story of this like truck that on its back carried so many records that we admire and love today. I just thought that was really cool to share. Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like, a share, subscribe, and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.